panel, the first panel of the conference. Do remember that there are parallel sessions, so the other panel is in the other breakaway. Just make sure that you're in the right, you've made the right choice. The title of this panel is Discursive Space Clearing. People will speak about the languages of food, entrenched assumptions, entrenched ideas. We have 3 speakers. They will each speak for about 20 minutes. There'll be a 10-minute short Q&A after each speaker, and we'll have a 15-minute general plenary discussion after that. I'll introduce each speaker just before they speak, but the first speaker is Mary Hames, and the title of her presentation is Eating for Health, a Journey Towards Becoming a Plant-Based Cook. Mary?
With you're shortly going to see. It's a very short clip. It's about 2 minutes long. And my presentation is showing the Namaqualand, the place of my birth and where I lived till the ripe old age of 18 until I came to university. And I want to explain because the background, the voiceover is in Afrikaans. In the video, I have pictures of my maternal grandmother, Margriete Damen, and my mother, Dorothy Hames. These women played a huge role in how I prepare my food today. In the clip, I use a poem that my aunt, Sally Damen, often recited each time she went back to Namaqualand. She passed away at the age of 91 after she had been a domestic worker since the age of 16 until she turned 76. All the time cooking and cleaning for white families. I also used the voiceover of my Aunt Ellen Marman explaining to me how to make sourdough potatoes. These days, the bread made of sourdough is being called artisanal, but way back it was a way of life for us. So the smell and the taste, the aromas of freshly baked bread in the outside oven will stay with me forever. So concepts like slow cooking have a totally different meaning to me than this contemporary interpretation of going back to your roots and taking life slowly. In the clip, you will notice outside kitchens or kookskerms, as we call it in Namaqualand, the cast iron pots that became the state symbols of today in which people make potjiekos. My mother always reminded me that this potjiekos thing was just a fad because as we grew up, we've made our stews in these iron pots on an outside fire as a way of life because there was no electricity. And when I called one of my cousins to inquire whether she still has photos of their kookskerm and the recipes for mother's famous pumpkin soup, she responded, "Please don't remind me of our poverty years." It reaffirmed also my standpoint that poverty is a social construct because none of us had access to electricity, running water, flushing toilets, things that we now take for granted. Until Telkom switches off the power or we are warned of day zero and have to keep the shower water to water the garden or flush the toilets. I also show some grinding utensils used by my grandmother and which was given to me by my mother. But these things are not quite unique, as all people across the globe have been using and are still using these implements when there is no access to electricity and all the modern gadgets that we now know. So globalization, as I have now done my research, has been going on long time. So it's not a new thing because we've exchanged throughout the years the recipes, the way to cook, the things we cook with, etc. So in South Africa, we will soon have to return to these old ways, as I sing, and I say tongue in cheek, of being and doing if load shedding is to become part of our life or if the drought will get more severe. So enjoy the clip. it. And the paintings at the end of the clip is by my cousin Gary Fryer, and it is for sale. It's of the real dance. It's a traditional dance in the Northern Cape. So the second part of my clip, and I want to start by quoting Morning Dove of the indigenous people in North America. Everything on earth has a purpose, and every disease on and herb to cure it, and every person has a mission. Mission has been to eat myself healthy. For the past 10 years, I've been diagnosed with what the medical profession calls chronic diseases. It's high blood pressure, it's type 2 diabetes, and it is high cholesterol. And as each year went by, the more the medication increased. And I'm being told that I would never get better and that I have to learn how to manage my health. So a few months ago, I set myself on a goal to decrease the medication and even try to eat myself healthy. After all, if these are lifestyle diseases and I've eaten myself sick, then I can try to eat myself well. But the journey took me on different courses and led me to unearth many things. And during my research, um, it confirmed my suspicions. Number one, the big pharma in the medical profession are in cahoots. Sorry, you often waive your rights to access the free services offered by the different pharmaceutical agents under the guise of managing your health. And the three big culprits are Sanofi, Johnson and Johnson, and Pfizer. So there's actually for me a dangerous liaison um, to the cost of managing your health, because they use these things, all these free services and equipment that they give you to actually get data um, on how they can manage and make profits of you being diseased. Number two, the market economy exploits the way food is produced, and its marketing strategies are very, very seductive. Let us look at the current market language, and I'm sure the vegans are going to cringe. The traditional beef and chicken fast food places are now advertising plant-based burgers. I mean, you see the big billboards along the road. Um, like, for instance, Burger King is advertising plant-based burgers. Then also Woolworths, Checkers, Spar, Pick and Pay all now have plant-based or vegan vegetarian sections. You find tofu, you find plant-based milk even at the corner shops. Fry has started as a family concern in KwaZulu-Natal, but now its vegan food become big time producers, and you find it in all the major supermarkets, the packaging, the advertising. And one should be concerned about these foods, because how is it produced? What are they putting in to preserve it so that it can be transported long distances? And why does it have to be kept frozen or in a freezer? You get highly processed plant sausages, patties, mince, even egg and bacon. These plant-based versions of the real thing are for me really highly suspicious. And can they really be healthy? Thirdly, and that brings me to my grandmother. When I grew up, there is no electricity, no fridge. We mainly ate plants, fresh fruit and vegetables, and seasonal produce was preserved in bottles or dried. And we only occasionally eat meat because there was no way that the meat could be preserved for a long period unless it was made into biltong. And for those not from South Africa, it's dry pieces of meat. So there's also the myth that when you come from the Maculand, you are a meat eater. Fourthly, there's also this whole thing around the terminology that is being used. I started off when I told everybody I'm a plant-based eater. But then, terms like power food, plant-based, like I said, big economy and markets are actually using the very same terms. And for instance, the way they package and advertise, like blueberries are regarded as a power food. But in my research, I found that all berries, such as strawberries, raspberries, all kinds of berries, have the same qualities. Again, the market economy uses this language to mainly sell its products and make profit. Frozen produce is vis-a-vis the fresh makes the assumption of middle classness. For instance, you can afford electricity, you can afford a fridge, you can afford to go to these big supermarkets. So there's assumption that you actually live a certain lifestyle. But there are also other things in this plant-based orientation. It was for me the desertification. And I'm particularly thinking of how an immaculate is slowly but surely being turned into a desert. The effect of profit making has an impact on how ambivalent I'm starting to feel about the good food. We are losing forests and fertile land because of the overproduction for profit. Let us look, for instance, at soya beans. Soya is supposed to be good for us. But look at what is happening in Brazil and the disappearance of the Amazon. The exploitation of women and child labor in China and with the production of the highly processed tofu that comes from soya. So it's also about the question around the goodness of almonds. I mean, you get almond milk, you get raw almonds, eat at least 5 a day, they say. But this is also, a high concern because of the high use of water, and particularly in countries that's prone to drought. Montague, nearby us, has become the center for almond cultivation in South Africa. Then, of course, there's also the different kinds of milk being produced from plants. And so now it is a big time profit making. As soon as big business shows interest in producing large quantities of soy milk, coconut milk, almond milk, rice milk, and the list continues. They've now started to talk about terms of post milk period. So in the small scale farmer or the person is actually producing uh, vegetables in the backyard and making milk and all sorts of things out of that is being pushed out of the equation. And this milk is thrice as much as cow's milk. So again, it is buying into a whole middle classness. So food and cooking competitions also make plant-based trendy. Even competitions on plant-based braaiing is currently on our local TV screens. So Namaqualand is slowly turning into a desert. Its mineral resources depleted. It once had flourishing mining towns where copper and diamonds were mined. Komagas had lush fruit and vegetable gardens where my Oma lived. My parents had a farm full of goats and wheat. There is nothing, absolutely nothing now. It's totally desert. The homestead fell into disarray. And Namaqualand has become the dumping ground of nuclear waste and gaping holes where the copper mines have been. The departure of big money meant and left behind physical and mental trauma. And they are literally ghost towns left behind by the big De Beers, etc. So even the koekenboom or the quiver tree is moving slowly to a different place, millimeter by millimeter over the last decades. And the once natural flower carpets of white, yellow, orange, purple are no more. They are artificially cultivated by sowing the seeds. And all these things are actually making me think and how I eat, why I eat, and how and when I will get healthy again. Thank you.
That was perfect timing, 20 minutes on the dot. Um, I also felt that you raised such a lot from the video and the ideas that were raised around what it means to think about indigeneity in relation to food and space. Um, what it means to think about hybridized meanings attached to food. And Iona put it very well. If I can find her a quote, her question, she posted quite a few things. She said she likes the fact that you said always been fluid as a people, mixing freely, but now we have artificial borders which have been reified, and now we are subjected to mechanical mixing. And I think that the film raised that very clearly, even the way you juxtapose different cooking utensils to show that there's always been similar utensils, similar ingredients in a world that's always been globalized. And that globalization was somehow an organic and non-violent, well, probably violent, but certainly not the violence we see today. But the kind of globalization, the kind of mixing that we see today, Iona, you might want to correct me here, but this is how I'm reading you because I was thinking of something very similar. It's very forced. Yeah, do you want to say something a bit about those images specifically in your video?
Yes, I've used the grinding stone because I came across, whether you are in India, like I showed, the different kind of grinding stones, and they all made the same. And it is to actually produce small quantities for the household. It is not about mass production. So when my Oma wanted to um, grind the wheat for to make flour, to make bread, she used certain kinds of things. For bigger loaves, it was bigger things to grind the herbs. And I mean, I vividly remember also we had to go and pick some herbs when we were sick, or one of the children is sick, and so that she can put it on. So those utensils are being used all over, whether you're in South America, whether you're in North India, Japan, whether you're in the middle of our beautiful continent. These are the same utensils that's being used. Now we get good chef, master chef. Shops are being opening and you're being told you need this electric grinder to do the coffee or the herbs. And it is all about pro chef products. And people think if they don't have that, they haven't arrived. But I think these kinds of things, for me, if you use these old things, the traditional things, tools, the things just taste and smell much better because you take time. That's all what slow cooking is all about.
I think it's also linked to time, and I think also what is put into it, because this was another thread in the comments that were made that you raised very clearly in the second part after the video, where you spoke about the fact that the global food industry is now co-opting and manipulating what started off as being alternative and quite healthy and progressive, specifically plant-based. Because the kind of junk that is now being produced in the name of plant-based is frightening. In fact, I think the processing of plant-based food is going to be even more frightening than meat, because I think there'll be less regulation.
Because if you think the fries was a family affair, but fries are now being sold in Australia. It has now moved into the UK. It is in the US, etc. It's becoming big. Also, it's being packaged differently now. If you go to Checkers, etc., they have all fridges of. And like I said, they put so many things in so because they want the boerewors to taste like real boerewors. You know, the eggs is like patties in squares and it looks yellow. Like, what are they putting into these things? Bacon bits, you know, it is. It is frightening because it's highly processed food, and highly processed food cannot be healthy. So I am so thinking about a lot of things.
Yes. In some ways, I mean, your presentation raises it creates a story of, in the past was idyllic. The present is toxic, which seems as if you have a very cynical perspective. But Donna comments in the chat that you're making a very positive point. You are saying we can eat ourselves well. You are trying to eat yourself well. Can you just say something now about how you personally are doing that and avoiding the traps that we encounter in the present, such as processed plant food?
Yes, I found an organic nursery very close walking distance from me, about 2 minutes walk. So I'm usually these days buying plants there, and I'm preparing my own garden, as you've also seen in the clip. So I'm eating my beans, my spinach, my kale, it's my tomatoes, everything. My cucumbers are now busy growing. Plus, I'm also cultivating a worm farm. And I mean, it's a very small scale, but I've been giving stuff away already because even if you produce in a very small scale, it is too much for a few people to eat. So it is also that kind of building community and communal spirit that's coming through. And the last time I went to my GP, they've lowered my medication, where I usually had three tablets for high blood pressure. I now only use one, etc. So it's just amazing. I've lost some weight, etc. So my journey is continuing.
Mm, mm.
And it's not that I don't buy the stuff from the shops. I still do, but I'm trying to cut down.
Mm. Something that I think is going to surface though elsewhere also, and now with you too, is that so often the solutions to the food crises and the health crises caused by bad food are seen as ones that are purely individual, that one just has to take oneself in hand and find the right places. What about the structural problems? I mean, how does one balance personal interventions with more broader kind of collective political structural um, interventions?
I think because I've started the journey with me,
Mm,
and I mean, the Buddha says, to go out, you have to look in. So I'm first, I have to see if these things are working on me. I'm sure that I will
mm,
go out and I will share and I think this conference is the ideal opportunity also to start to make connections with people who want to eat themselves well. Because
mm,
even with diabetes too, in my research, I found that the way they've treated the type 2 diabetes was the same as they treated type 1 diabetes. Type
mm,
1 is people with no insulin. Type 2 is people with too much insulin.
mm,
So you cannot give people more insulin
mm,
who already can't use it up.
mm,
So these kinds of things is questioning. So I have conversations with my GP, with a dietitian. I've had conversations with my pharmacist, and she said to me, well, it's through me that through them that I'm still alive. I said, but to pump me full of these tablets and poison cannot be. I don't want to manage my health. I want to get better.
I think that's a wonderful phrase. I do think that we seriously need to interrogate our so-called medical discourse and the collusion between the medical profession, industry, and the food industry, because there's a lot of myth making out there, and we're being disempowered more and more. We are being denied access to knowledge, and we need to know. We need to know what's in our food. We need to know what food does to our bodies. It's just so important. So thank you very much for raising so much of that. I'm sure it's going to surface again in other presentations. So yeah, thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Desiree.
We can come back to Mary's presentation, remember, in the plenary. I see a clap floating up there, which is very nice. Disembodied clap.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So, I'm going to ask Rejoice Chipuriro. Also, a lot of myth making. I'm looking forward to this presentation. She is going to speak on looting or redistribution, redefining narratives of food rights and global food politics. And this has loomed very large in our COVID landscape, both in South Africa and the US. Thanks, Rejoice. You have 20 minutes.
Thank you, Desiree, and welcome to everyone who has just joined the plenary. I'll take it right from there. From the previous presentations, the comments, and the first themes that we shared, I think we see the power of narratives. And so my paper speaks to redefining the narratives. And just to give a brief background, maybe to the issue, in July this year, there was a lot of what started as a political issue around the former president Jacob Zuma and him being called for justice and to account for corruption charges erupted mostly from his home province of KwaZulu-Natal, with rioting, which started as an organized protest in support of the former president, but eventually it ended up with masses of people going into supermarkets or shopping malls. And though the media framed it with much as a looting exercise, branded as a criminal activity, a lot of the things that were taken out of the supermarket was actually food. And linking this to previous representations, what I gathered, especially from feminist discussions that were also led by the critical food studies, where we had presentations from women like Patricia McFadden, Marcia Andrews, what emerged were challenges to say the powerful voice of the media, of course, protected and led the framing of the incident in such a way that criminalized the Black people, mostly Black poor people that went into the shops as criminal activities, and at the same time people challenging the framing and the power of such narratives, because it ended up being in a whole global thing and it coming out as chasing away investors and not addressing the underlying issues, which is what I'm going to focus on in this paper. The structural issues that led to such events were kind of brushed off and not focused on. And this is what, or the alternatives that I want to bring out in the paper today, to say, how do we frame such incidences? And is it looting, or is what fellow feminists, as I mentioned earlier, in some platforms called redistribution, taking from the centers of power or these big food productions and supermarkets and giving it to the poor? So what stands out for me is the power of narratives around the food riots. Some named them in alternative platforms as food riots, but we see the coming in of global food politics during a time of COVID, where people that are already marginalized in the South African context, who could not access jobs or who could no longer afford to buy food because they had lost opportunity to go to work under the lockdown, they had lost the opportunities to make money, and food, which used to be close to them because of the lockdown measures, was no longer available. And so this opportunity, this crisis created different opportunities for voices and people to express themselves, perhaps as resistance. Again, the issue of power and control, I think it also emerged. I think, Desiree, you touched on it when you were sharing about the panels, to say issues of power and structures coming into play in the food narratives, in the rioting narratives, vis-a-vis the looting narrative, where people that did not have access, did not have a voice. None of the people that were looters or showcased as looting, none of them were given the platform to express themselves, to share where they were coming from and what was the cause. But we had so much hyper visibility of their action as barbaric, as criminal, being voiced by the powerful media, and the state and the media colluding with big business and the food monopoly industries to frame their own citizens as criminals. And such framing has a problematic way of finding solutions, because we saw even the way the state contained this issue, because it was framed as a criminal issue, it was dealt with in violence, and the violence of the state security being imposed on the people. People were arrested. And so, because power framed this as a criminal activity, the response to create stability and to protect investments gave the state the power to use violence as a force and to quell all the resistance that was coming. So, as the paper goes, it is crucial then for us to look at the social, the political, and the economic infrastructures of power that underlie the food scarcity and inaccessibility for the majority of the Black people, Black women and their families. And I'm using the term Black to include, I know in South Africa there are different rankings or hierarchies based on the previous racial classification. So in this context, I'll use Black to reflect anything that is labeled as non-white, which is where we see, in terms of structures in South Africa, 27 years after the democracy, that they are still issues of the same hierarchies that were there have remained and are continuously being perpetuated, despite the fact that South Africa is seen as a middle income country, is leading. And this is all because the issues around economics remain in the control of the few white, commercial, and investor protected enclaves. And in these enclaves, those who were previously excluded remain excluded. There have not been any active political will apart from the minor dressings in the terms of Black economic empowerment, which has its own challenges. But we see that the same displacements that were there in the social making of a separate economy which protected the minority few and disempowered the Blacks, removed them from their land, removed them from their ability to make their own food, grow their own food, and be in charge of their own economic power, has now come into this entrenchment of enclaves of big investors, commercial white farmers. And the power of narrative, again, is seen as shattering the South Africa social fabric. I heard earlier on people sharing how food can be a communal, something that can bring people together. And we see in this case of the July food riots, or looting as they were called in the mainstream media, that food became the rallying point for those who could not access and tried to use the opportunity to access food, whilst at the same time it was used to separate and disenfranchise and disempower people from making their own and relying solely on these food monopolies, which they could now not afford because of the COVID restrictions, loss of jobs and loss of livelihoods and loss of incomes. And my paper also centered on women's narratives from different networks and social movements that challenge these hegemonic food security narratives and policies, which exclude marginalized women in what is called informalized local food systems. So the issue of framing, when we look at women in South Africa, I'm looking again at the racial categories of Black vis-a-vis the white communities. Women are at the lowest rank of the hierarchy, and they are not regarded as farmers or food producers in a commercial level or in a level that is seen as productive. But I liked on one of the presentations that happened with the minister where Professor Ruth Hall challenged the myth that came from one of these big agricultural groups that looks at white commercial farmers, where they were declaring that African women are not able to, they are emerging farmers. And she mentioned that if you look at numbers, we are looking at about 300, we are looking at quite a huge number of people labeled as informal and therefore not counted in the formal economy. And yet, if we look at their proximity to the communities that they serve, as street vendors, for example, selling food on the streets, they were more closer to most of those people that ended up now moving to locating or looking for food in these supermarkets. So the issue of framing and how food security in South Africa is linked to commercial tech, big technology and a big financial or investor, which is not also accessible to the majority of the Black women who are classified as informal local food systems. So that framing also means that others are excluded. We are talking of space. There's a space which is reserved for the formalized, those who have access to voice and media and all that. And then the ones that are excluded are put in an informal sector where it is under-resourced. And in the case of the COVID-19, we saw that most of the information was not targeting, and they were also labeled as carriers of dirt, of disease, because they did not have proper hygiene. And so there was an initial move to close down on these informal and unhygienic food sources in which most of the women would find themselves, or the space to get closer to the people. So for me, I think it then comes to the issue of food in the social justice space, inequality, and the relevance. What does it mean for families that have low income, especially in the COVID-19 crisis, which exacerbated the historical burden of class, race, and gendered inequalities, which affected disproportionately the Black people? So in the framing, power issues come in, and the less powerful are made invisible. And by making them invisible, their narratives are removed, and the dominant narratives determine the solution. And most of the solutions are often technocratic, top down, and where you would think that this crisis would create an opportunity for the two worlds to meet and to talk, it was not the case. So I think as a social justice issue, this is a case that calls for the two worlds to come together and to look at alternative ways of framing and alternative solutions that are not top down, that are not exclusionary, but that include the whole plethora. And as it stands, though it seems as if it has been covered and everything is now okay, it is a matter of time, because the structures are still in place, the structures are still unchallenged, and there is no dialogue between the two worlds. And sadly to say, it seems that the two worlds will not meet at the rate at which the problems have been resolved and solved. So, as a way forward, I think it is important that women's voices, or those who are impacted, are centered, and that issues of power are constantly challenged, which is the role of activists, which is the role of the civil society, which is also an individual act of resistance. But also, I think what is required more is structural resistance to make sure that all the voices are on the table and that power is challenged and speaking truth to power. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rejoice. I think that is it's so important for us to be unraveling these discourses that pathologize legitimate protests. Um, your presentation made me think about the way that food is increasingly becoming weaponized by
Yes.
elites, by states, by the media. And Yoma mentioned the media's role. The media, of course, played a huge role and always plays a huge role in spreading these stories about marauding masses illogically and irrationally running around with their dirty bodies and stealing other people's property. But it's not just the mass media, it's public opinion. You know, people who quite often sort of think fairly clearly, who just don't see beyond certain things. So I think a really careful unpacking of the force of these discourses, which is what you do, raises a lot. I mean, this idea of the good citizen versus the bad citizen. Tinashe raised a question that he really wants a response to. I'm also very curious. But he wants to know what parallels you would draw between the food riots that we have recently witnessed, so-called food riots. It's interesting also that riots is used rather than protest. And the food looting, again, a very laden word in Zimbabwe in the 90s. And maybe I can tackle another question, which is the food protests that led to the Black Lives Matter movement. It's interesting that these are very similar pockets. Yeah.
So if I understand the question, they want to see if there are any parallels between the three kind of pockets that you've mentioned.
Yeah, maybe just start with the Zimbabwean, which is Tinashe's question. Tinashe wants to know whether you see any parallels between the example you are dealing with, the South African one, and the Zimbabwean one in the 90s.
Yes, I think if we look at the whole basis of things, it's about those who are marginalized, who are excluded, trying to access the privileged spaces of food. So the South African, though I would say Zimbabwe and South Africa share the same colonial space and the same colonial challenges where the blacks were disempowered and disenfranchised, and the food was in the monopoly of food markets and commercial growers. So, drawing from that parallel, I think the background or the historical context in which these protests occur are quite similar. And also, if we look at the Zimbabwe context, then there was a lot of things happening in terms of you would see that there was this whole drive of bringing the new Zimbabwe or making them modern, and government taking on a lot of investments, credit, and then the local people that could not access ended up resisting and going in. Food was now very expensive because of all the investments that had gone into boosting commercial supplies and all that, which I think is the same in South Africa again, where there is investment in these pockets or enclaves at the demise of the others which are deemed informal, and people can no longer access. Food becomes expensive, closed in enclaves, and as a result, the resistances or the protest emerge. So there is, whilst there are bit different, but I think from that common basis and flow of things or progression of things, which I can see that the same things that have happened in Zimbabwe, though decades before, there is sort of like a South African following up along the same path in terms of challenging access to means of production and producing our own foods, and also the taking over by monopoly capital. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I think that Tinashe wants to come back to that because Tinashe's also got some interesting readings of the symbolism of acts of protest in relation to food, which sound to me fascinating. But I just want to read one other question that you can just respond to. It's from Nakijoba Sarah. Says, thank you. With or without COVID challenges, rioters have a tendency of storming food centers. Perhaps moral degeneration can be pointed to. I'm not sure if you can make sense of that. Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think if I understood the question, it's saying people with or without COVID, there's moral degeneration. In other words, saying it's criminal activity and people just want to go and grab things that do not belong to them. And I think, Desiree, you touched on it, the issue of public opinion coming in this case, maybe a personal opinion that there is degradation of morals and people feel that they can. But I think if one is to interrogate, which is what I intended to do, such framings of good versus bad citizen, for example, the ones that have moral decay, that are running and trying to loot. I mean, it comes to the issue of the media, and I think the media has successfully framed such actions as emanating not from structural issues that we want to expose, but throwing the ball into the court of the individuals as being a more immoral and not being good citizens. But if we look into the undercurrency of what happens, people are not illogical as the media wants to frame them. People do have, I don't think anyone would want to wake up and say, I'm just going to run into supermarkets and start stealing. But there are severe structural issues that have been silenced. And what has been made hyper visible is just the outcome of long-standing structural issues that no one wants to address. And I think that is the crux of the matter. There are underlying issues. People would not want to lose their dignity and be caught on camera running around and stealing unless there are deep issues that enforce them. And to me, it comes to the issue of power, politics, and structure that needs to be dealt with, rather than shifting the blame just on moral decay and ignoring the structural things that need to be confronted and addressed. Thank you.
No, I think that is a very, very clear response. Just in relation to what you say, what I was also very intrigued by in the media misrepresentation were all these stories and the images of good South Africans, black and white, sweeping the streets. I mean, it was such a clear message that this is what it means to be a good citizen,
Yeah.
and very compelling. So the media plays some highly sophisticated and very persuasive games. But I want to go back to Tinashe because, because we have quite a bit of time and there aren't other questions really, and you seem to really want to take up a conversation. Do you want to step onto the stage and talk about your reading? Rejoice, I think you can stay there. Rejoice. Stay there, but I think Tinashe wants to just have a conversation with you. I can actually. Tinashe, are you open to that or not? Nope. Okay, no response from Tinashe there. Maybe we'll hear more in his presentation. Are there any
Yeah.
other comments or questions? I think,
He's on board now.
Tinashe, go
No,
for it.
hello, Desiree, hello, Rejoice. I think
Hi, Tinashe.
yeah, I think my connection is just slow. So I just wanted to concur with Rejoice that the media is actually focused like on a single voice. That is actually uh, based on the Luther discourse. That does not actually look, at the other silences, that were actually heard at this moment of looting in courts, of course. So personally, I actually took this as the looting itself as a performance of inequalities, certain voices, that are not actually given a chance. And like I said, I was actually fascinated by, how for instance, there's that video of a cake looter,
Mm,
and perhaps how the media itself failed to notice some of the metaphoric uh, aspects of the incident itself, and how the incident can also be used actually to laugh at power, in terms of how it denied access to particular people, and sort of like consumed the national cake alone. So I just wanted to comment on that. That I really agree that the media focused on the sort of like they mostly took one angle. They approached the story from one angle, and did not focus on how this incident is revealed the other silenced voices. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Tinashe. Rejoice, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, I think Tinashe raises a very valid points. And coming back to the issue of the media, we we seem to be concurring, and even with yourself, Desiree, that the media is a powerful tool used by the powerful to frame issues in a certain and particular way that privileges their point of view and silences the others, because none, I can't remember, or if I missed it, of any of the people that were involved in all this being spoken to or being addressed. And everything else, their voice, they were spoken on, they were spoken about and spoken on, and not brought onto the table and discussed. And as a result, because of that framing, it gave government the tools to use violence to suppress in the name of bringing order. So the media is in actual space, and it's normally funded by the same powerful people. If you look at the funding of the media, so they fund it to use it as a voice to then set up a framework and solutions that justify the actions.
Mm. There are lots of comments and lots of clapping hands floating up. I'm going to read a few because we have just like, 1 minute, and you might want to have a quick rounding off comment. Angelo Fix says the framing of people's conduct in terms of morality allows the erasure of the political and sociological accounts, which is very much what you said. Mary Ames raised the provocation. What about the continuing dehumanization of Black people in this country? Um, Yvette's raised something that I think really is going to be taken up further throughout this conference, I hope. A theme that is emerging is around the perils of modernization in an uncritical sense. Modernization has left us landless and food stressed. Deep parallels with vaccination debates. Um, another one. Thanks so much. Questions. Given the extreme historical marginalization of this anti-Zuma arrest looting to the looting narrative. Sorry, I've got I'm mixed up my questions here. Given the extreme historical marginalization of so many, we should have continued food rights. What politics agency play out to unlock such processes? I don't know if you want to pitch in there. It's just such a lot. We can also take some of these questions and comments after, because you can scroll through them. Shall we do it that way? Because we're going to otherwise cut into the next speaker's time.
Yeah, I think it's already 11 o'clock, but just
Yes.
in a second, I think I liked one comment that came that we need to be more nuanced when we refer to the media, because some of the community radio stations, for example, did not echo the mainstream media. So yes, I do agree that it's something that needed to come out, the differentiation of which media we're talking about. And of course, it's the mainstream media. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Rejoice. Thanks so much for that. I don't see the floating hand, so I'm going to do my hand. Thank you. The last speaker is Sorry, I'm going to struggle to pronounce your name. Srivastava. And the title of her paper is To Consume or Be Consumed. Be Consumed, an inquiry into the sexual textual politics of food and women. Another fascinating sounding topic to me. Thanks, Sona.
Hi, I'll just share my screen. Please let me know if it's visible to you.
Okay.
Yeah, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
okay, so
fine.
I'll begin. So the title of my presentation today is To Consume or Be Consumed, an inquiry into the sexual textual politics of food and women. Before I delve into the theoretical aspect of the paper, I wish to present a few slides. I'll not comment on these right now. I just want you as participants to look at these images and decide for yourself if you have a bone of contention to pick with these. Are these images neutral or are they loaded with particular meanings? Quotidian practices of identity are accrued through recognized performances. Consuming or abstaining from food is one such recognized performance. Food and drink as everyday preoccupations are woven throughout ideologies that constitute our changing understandings of how the world works and what our places within it are or can be. In our talk about food, whether we are having a meal with family and friends or contemplating the problems in global food systems, we are continually negotiating, debating, eschewing, and reinforcing aspects of our social identities and our beliefs about food. Specifically, food and drink serve as prominent stance objects in the constant negotiation of gendered identities. Eating and feeding are acts that enable modes of cultural analysis that are attentive to sex, ethnicity, wealth, poverty, geopolitical locations, class, and gender. Eating makes these categories matter again. It roots actual bodies within these relations. Food and gender intersect in significant ways. Food functions as a symbolic conflicted site, one that simultaneously reproduces patriarchal values. An answer to this drama of the interconnectedness between food and gender is readily available through Helen Sissou. She writes, let us take the scene of the apple. The first fable of her first book is a fable in which What is at stake is the relationship to the law. It is a struggle between the apple and the discourse of God. What Eve will discover in her relationship to simple reality is the inside of the apple, and that this inside is good. The story tells us that the genesis of woman goes through the mouth, through a certain oral pleasure. In the Genesis narrative of the fall, sin and death enter the world when a woman eats. In extreme fidelity, Helen Sissel claims that this Eve story, the scene of the apple, is the guiding myth of Western culture, a fable about the subjection of female oral pleasure to the regulation of patriarchal law. It is an allegory of what she calls libidinal education, the individual's discovery of the body and the cultural prohibitions surrounding it. Continuing in the same vein, albeit a different food item, is Nick Feeds, who equates food and sexual intercourse. Traditionally, hunger is seen as a basic drive for survival of the individual, while sex is a basic drive for survival of the species. It might be expected that there could be some parallels and interactions between these fundamental activities. Natural analogies between sex and eating, that both perpetuate life, that both may be pleasurable, and that both imply vulnerability by breaching normal bodily boundaries, may partly explain the connection. It is perhaps only to be expected that each should carry a multiplicity of meanings extending beyond its respective province, and even that they should be associated. But the parallels are nonetheless significant, since food selection reflects cultural conceptions, as do ideas about sexuality, what gender is, what men and women are, what sorts of relations do or should obtain between them. All these notions do not simply reflect or elaborate upon biological givens, but are largely products of social and cultural processes. The question is not why, but how do we associate sex with eating? One example is the notion of man the hunter, a figure who seemed to stalk the world over. Collier and Rosaldo found unexpected regularities in the gender conceptions of several simple societies, particularly that man the hunter, which we thought to be a myth, turned out to characterize their conception of maleness. For the Maasai youth, the transition to adulthood is marked by his washing with the blood of a goat he has killed for sharing. A Kung boy is considered eligible for marrying only after killing his first animal, and men are said to chase, kill, and eat women just as they do animals, while femaleness negates hunting prowess. Thus, men are routinely and ritually in a position of controllers, hunters, providers, and also primary consumers of food with first claim on available resources. Antiquity too seems to corroborate Faid's claims. Ruby and Hind mention how meat has historically been linked with manhood, not only directly, but through an ideological web of characteristics traditionally linked with masculinity, such as power and virility. Women, second class citizens, are more likely to eat what are considered second class foods in a patriarchal culture vegetables, fruits, and grains rather than meat, or best go hungry by way of fasting. Dental pathology studies at Apollonia have shown that there are slight differences in diet between males and females. Females consumed more carbohydrates, that is, cereal crops, and males consumed more protein. Regulating women by way of regulating their diet becomes one of the many ways masculinity is performed and symbolic violence inflicted. Commanding and controlling power that creates a hierarchy was applied to the concept of gender by Cornell, who described masculine hegemony as the configuration of gender practices, which embodies the currently accepted answers to the problems of legitimacy of patriarchy, which guarantees, or is taken to guarantee, the dominant position of men and the subordination of women. To be at the top of the hegemonic order requires one to perform masculinity. Masculinity is linked with rationality, strength, activity, self, and war, whereas in contrast, femininity is associated with irrationality, weakness, passivity, and peace. Partaking food precipitates symbolic violence in a number of literary texts. from Milton's Paradise Lost to the very acclaimed and contemporary novel The Edible Woman by Margaret Atwood. Symbolic violence can also be understood as that streak of violence that permeates our lives quite unconsciously. Unnoticed, its domination is maintained through everyday habits like eating food, a convenient metaphor for power, and an extremely subtle means of examining the relationship between men and women. Feminist literary scholars who first began to study the interrelationships between eating and literary authority in women's literary texts in the late 1970s and early 1980s. In their groundbreaking, The Madwoman in the Attic, for example, Sandra M. Gilbert and Susan Goober drew from the fairy tale of Snow White a paradigm of female conflict embodied in the poisonous Eve's apple. The wicked queen offers Snow White, half red, half white, half poisonous, half pure. The apple represented for Gilbert and Goober 19th century female choices between plotting and plotlessness, assertion and silence, sexual energy and self creation. Demonic wants a life of significant action, by definition, an unfeminine life of stories and storytelling, and therefore, to the extent that Snow White as a daughter is a part of herself, she wants to kill the Snow White in herself, the angel who would keep deeds and dramas out of her own house. Gilbert and Hooper went on to argue that hunger and starvation on the one hand, speech and storytelling on the other, serve as central tropes dramatizing the conflicts of female literary authority in the 19th century. Rejecting the poison apple her culture offers her, the woman writer often becomes, in some sense, anorexic, resolutely closing her mouth on silence even while she complains of starvation. Thus, both Charlotte and Emily Bront depict the travails of starved or starving anorexic heroines, while Emily Dickinson declares in one breath that she had been hungry all the years, and in another opts for sumptuous destitution. Similarly, Christina Rossetti represents her own anxiety of authorship in the split between one heroine who longs to suck on goblin fruit and another who locks her lips fiercely together in a gesture of silent and passionate renunciation. Excuse me. Before I dive deeper into the particular examples of Charlotte Brown's Jane Eyre and Christina Rossetti's Goblin Market, I also wish to make a particular connection between food and women by grounding it in medieval theology. Bynum scholarship allows one to understand the edibility of women's bodies. Although working within a particular historical period, her scholarship strongly resonates to the present times where the ideal woman has no appetite. The woman without appetite politely finishes what is on her plate and declines seconds. She is satisfied and satisfiable. A man's diet is the lion's share, it is always hearty. But a woman with an appetite is always voracious. Her hunger overreaches because it is not supposed to exist. Bynum locates this predicament in the 13th and 14th centuries spirituality, where food, money, and sex had a seductive aura around them. Food was a major economic and religious concern, a concern blatantly regulated and controlled by the men. Medieval people often saw gluttony as a major form of lust and fasting as the most painful renunciation. Vicious stories of food hoarding merchants, of cannibalism, of infanticide, of sick adolescents left to die when they could no longer work, survive in sources suggesting a world in which hunger and even starvation were not uncommon. The possibility of overeating and of giving away food to the unfortunate was a mark of privilege, of aristocratic or patrician status, a particularly visible form of what we call conspicuous consumption, what medieval people call magnanimity, gorging and vomiting, luxuriating in food until food and body were almost synonymous, became in folk literature, like Hansel and Gretel, an image of unbridled sensual pleasure, that magic vessels forever brimming over with food and drink were staples of European fairy tales. Even in hagiography, and folktale alike, a standard indication of heroic or saintly generosity exists. Self starvation, the deliberate and extreme renunciation of food and drink, seemed to medieval people that the most basic asceticism requiring the kind of courage and holy foolishness that marked the saints. To repress eating and hunger was to control the body in a discipline far more basic than any other achieved. Christianity's preoccupation with women and food found a fertile soil in the 13th and 14th centuries. Eating was stereotyped to be a male activity, and the food preparation was done by the female, undergirded by biological logic that a woman is the one who gives her own body to be eaten. She first nourishes the child in her womb and then gives it milk. This activity continues in a less concentrated form throughout the years. Her passion is to give food. This was also a convenient trope to limit women to the kitchens. The notion that woman is to man as to matter is to spirit flourished, and woman quickly became synonymous with the physical, the lustful, the material, the appetitive part of the human nature, while man symbolized the spiritual, the rational, and the mental. Many assumptions in the theology and culture of Europe identified woman with flesh and food. Thus, food, by what it seems to symbolize sacrifice and service, came to be. And in Christian doctrine, the suffering, broke, crucified body on the cross, from which springs humankind's salvation, is food. Women's bodies in the acts of lactation and of giving birth were analogous to ordinary food and to the body of the Christ, as it died on the cross and gave birth to salvation. Food thus symbolized many things to Christians, and they acknowledged their sinfulness by renouncing food. Moreover, they received their God most intimately in that holy meal in which He became bread and wine. If to eat Christ is to become Christ, then moderate and modest consumption of food nourishes piety. Grounded in the similar literary topos of passionate yearning for food forbidden, Rossetti's Goblin Market has often been read as an allegory of the fall, in which Laura, one of the poem's two sister protagonists, serves as a typological descendant of Genesis' hungry Eve. Tempted by the preternaturally luscious fruits hogged by an itinerant troop of goblin men, curious Laura disregards the counsel of her cautioning lips. We must not look at goblin men, we must not buy their fruits, and purchases the salesman produced with a lock of golden hair. Her punishment for capitulating to physical craving is the exceeding pain of desire. Unable to see the goblins or hear their customary cry after gorging on the bears, Laura slips into a life threatening decline and is saved only by the altruistic actions of her more circumspect sister, Lizzie, who procures a fiery antidote from the mysterious traders while resisting their sinister attempts to make her eat their merchandise. Within this poetic paradigm of temptation, Laura clearly exhibits the self indulgence that is associated with Eve. The description of Laura's zealous ingestion of the goblin fruit, she sucked and sucked and sucked the more, resonates intertextually with Eve's unrestrained gorging, while the punitive longing Laura experiences after tasting the goblin fruit. She dreamed of lemons as a traveler sees, falls waves in desert drought, and burns the thirstier in the sandful breeze. Similarly invites comparison with what Rossetti calls the sentence of unsatisfied desire imposed upon her biblical antecedent. Lizzie, by contrast, embodies the self oblation and submission that Rossetti identifies in the Virgin Mary. Fearful that her sister seems to be knocking at death's door, Lizzie seeks out the goblin men and offers them a silver penny for a takeaway portion of the fruits, politely but firmly declining their invitations to sit down and eat with them. Even when the frustrated vendors turn violently against her, squeezing their fruits against her mouth and pinching her black as ink, she remains resolute, enduring their assault in the hope that her juice stained body will provide proxy nourishment to her ailing sister. Returning home, Lizzie invites Laura to come and kiss me, never mind my bruises. Hug me, kiss me, suck my juices, squeezed from goblin fruit for you, goblin pulp and goblin dew. Eat me, drink me, love me. Laura, make much of me by asking Laura to come and kiss me, never mind my bruises. She combines a spiritual love for Laura and a new appreciation of the physical aspects of love, acquiring a healing and fulfilling element when it has a spiritual dimension. At the end of the poem, Rossetti depicts Laura and Lizzie in nurturing role of blissful motherhood. Lizzie functions as a female Christ figure, advocating a role of the Redeemer for women. Lizzie is able to cool down Laura, and both are able to enjoy the fruits of domesticity, driving home the point that true happiness for a woman can be achieved only when she has toned down her passions, is innocent, and almost unaware of her sexual needs. The ultimate prize for the virtuous woman is happiness in her domestic life. Laura was not sexually frank, but she had also dared to venture into a man's place, the market for exchange, leaving behind her domestic duties. She had gone astray. True liberation for a woman lies in the happiness within the four walls and further nurturing tender lives and warning them against the wicked, quaint, fruit merchant men. The dietary regulation to moderate or negate sexual energy also figures in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre and John Webster's The Duchess of Malfi. Counseling the young Jane Eyre in the avoidance of going to hell, Mr. Brocklehurst tells her an anecdote. I have a little boy younger than you who knows 6 psalms by heart, and when you ask him which he could rather have a gingerbread nut to eat or a verse to learn, he says, oh, the verse of a psalm. Angels sing psalms, says he. I wish to be a little angel here below. He then gets 2 nuts in recompense for his infant piety. A very telling anecdote, it draws our attention to the way institutions functioned to control and discipline female sexual energy. Jane's companion, Helen Burns, embodies extreme selfless Christian spirituality, a stark contrast to the devil in the flesh that is Bertha. At Lockwood, Brocklehurst disciplines its intimates by attempting to destroy their individuality by punishing and starving their sexuality. The mission of the school under him is to mortify in these girls the lusts of the flesh and the spiritual edification of the pupils, in other words, to turn them into asexual starved automatons. Helen is the good girl, the little saint, who dies of consumption, pun intended. Jane faces dietary discrimination not only at Lockwood but also at her aunt's place, where the 10-year-old orphan is excluded from festivities such as the Reed's family Christmas. While she hungers, her stout cousin John Reed gorges himself habitually at table. The rest of the novel builds on Rochester's carnal appetite for Jane and a subsequent negotiation with the extreme morals of the angel in the house, that is Helen, and the fallen woman Bertha, that leads her to declare her autonomy. I am my own mistress. It is after the cooling down of passions of both Jane and Rochester that they are able to embark on a domestic life of their own. In The Duchess of Malfi, the simmering sexual tension boils over when the expecting Duchess makes a demand for apricots. A history of the exoticness of the fruit helps in making explicit the connection between the Duchess's body and the fruit. As early as the 1570s, Rembo Dodin's New Herbal informed English readers of Descarad's warning about the fruit. Being ripe, they lose the belly and engender naughty humors. However, Webster came by this belief. He appears to have used it in creating the climax to Act 2, Scene 1. It is also significant to note that apricots were called the apples of Armenia, the symbolism difficult to miss in the corpus of the text, where the widow duchess transgresses by courting her steward. The apricots come to symbolize her own temptation, and by making a demand for the fruit, she signs the deal for her fall. Basola's comments on the greed with which she eats them can hardly fail to call up the association between gastronomic appetite and sexual appetite. I would now like to go back to discuss the significance of the few pictures and slides that I had shown in the beginning, which actually just sums up the association of the edibility of women's bodies and food. No, and by way of concluding, eating is not a neutral activity. Our consumption of texts also entails a consumption of ideologies embedded in them. We're all in for a ride when Alice says, I know something interesting is sure to happen whenever I eat or drink anything, and I hope this paper, as it speaks of food and drink, was as interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Soni. That was incredibly comprehensive. I really found it very compelling. I was especially interested in your attention to symbolic violence because I was thinking of the examples that you use, the readings of those texts. Take one straight back to the present, but in a strange way where, there's much more self-regulation of women's bodies. So women's bodies are still being regulated through the media, through being told how to be beautiful and thin and be in control of themselves. But it's so internalized. And I was wondering if you have any reflections on the kind of regulation that's happening now in a so-called post-feminist context.
Yes, thank you for this. And also, sorry, I just realized that I actually took a long time to wrap up my presentation. Um,
Yes.
I think one of the very blatant examples is in the Indian context. So the association that I made between fasting and women fasting and the associated idea of this that if women fast, it's the self-effacing love. I think it also centers back to how the whole food industry, or in fact the fashion industry, centers itself around women's bodies, in the sense you have to diet. So dieting, if one is to if one say, like, if one just pronounces diet, the image that comes is actually of the woman first, and
Hmm.
it's always women dieting. So I think this is a very blatant example where self-regulation, conscious and unconscious both, seem to exist. So yeah, I hope I answered this. Like,
Yeah,
this is
yeah.
very.
I, I think what you also raised is something else that I found fascinating is just what a crucial role commodity capitalism plays now too. I mean, before it was easier to kind of identify patriarchal structures and ideology, whereas commodity capitalism has such a lot to gain from the regulation of women's bodies through the sale of products and fashion and stuff. Um, so yeah, that also just seems so interesting. I don't know if you want to say anything more about that since you raised it.
No, yeah, this is this is it.
Yes, okay. Are there any other? I think people found that so compelling that people are still digesting. So fascinating. Sona's presentation brought back to mind the novel by Han Kang, The Vegetarian.
Oh yeah, that's
Thanks.
my
Lots
favorite.
of, is it?
Yeah, I was refraining from mentioning that.
Okay. Do you want to say something briefly about it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I absolutely love that novel, and I have also presented a few papers on the similar theme of consumption. And I think that novel, again, with the edibility, the idea of edibility at its core, how women's bodies are consumed in a patriarchal structure, especially brings to the fore the patriarchal norms in Korean society. And with the Korean, so the K drama trend, it's like very popular. It's catching up in India also, and this whole idea of how appealing one has to look. So
Mm.
I think the novel quite beautifully addresses everything. There is there so like Yonghai, who's the protagonist, her sister actually runs a beauty shop, and Yonghai is the one who gives up meat. And giving up meat is also something which is very strange, because it's again it's so ingrained in them that you can't give up any food item without consulting the elders in that particular socio-cultural context. And how Yongai negotiates, or in fact, so we're never given into the subjectivity of Yongai. We never read things from her end. It is always her husband and her brother-in-law and her sister who narrate Yonghai through their eyes. And
Mm,
it's kind of beautiful in the sense you come to know of their conflicting emotions, the patriarchal and also the sisterly bond that appears towards the end, which is kind of a hint at the future, like what is female solidarity and what future does it
mm,
have. So also the ethics of eating, like is vegetarianism the answer? And
mm,
is this how feminists care for animals as well? So I think
mm,
another way to look at it is through the works of Carol J. Adams. She is a vegetarian, like she calls herself an animal ethicist and an animal rights activist and a feminist. And her scholarship has been very instrumental in building my understanding of the
mm.
novel.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed that. Many people, I think, did. We've now reached a point where we can open up the discussion. Even if you feel you're digressing, um, that's fine. If you would like to take the floor and not just post a question. For me, I mean, there have been such interesting connections between these papers. Um, the way in which food features in class narratives, racialized discourses, and gendered discourses, and the way that food plays a practical role too in class, racialized, and gendered struggles. We can also go back to some of the questions that were asked earlier. So please post your comments in the chat. Maybe I can also invite the two other speakers to rejoin us. Do you want to come back? Rejoice and Mary? Can they come back? Because it's a bit odd to have a conversation about someone's paper when you can't see them. Where are they? Yes, they can. Rejoice and Mary, please join us. In the meantime, any other comments or questions? I'm just looking through the... Not sure where they are. And you thought that you were running out of time. How long have you been working on this, Sona?
Started working on this when I was in my undergrad, and it's just been in the pipeline. So I keep
Mm,
reading, and I think I managed to write this paper only this year, which is like 2-3 years after I developed the core ideas.
mm, mm. because it's incredibly rich. It's really prompted me to think through such a lot.
Thank you.
Where are the other speakers? So, people, any questions or comments of a general nature that you might want to ask on stage? Okay, it's a question from Pule. Can you comment on the domestic lives of women and consumption in the context of the global south? It's a big question. I don't know, Sona, do you want to ask it? Do you want to respond, or do you want to ask for something sort of more specific?
No, I think I'll be able to respond. Like in the sense, in the context of the global south, I can voice my thing from like in the by grounding it in the Indian context, definitely South Asian context. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, the whole idea of venerating women's bodies and is very much common. So like whatever observations I made in this paper apply to most of the households in the South Asian context as well, where it's better, or it's naturally just assumed that women can starve themselves. It's better, like it's good for them, and the males, since they are the ones who go out, do who do jobs and have real jobs, actual jobs, because looking after the household is not an actual job or an actual work. So most of it also applies there. And also, um, there I'm forgetting the name of a novel, which again was very similar to Han Kang's The Vegetarian, and it also dealt, but again, the whole idea, if I were to compare meat and women's bodies, is more or less the same. In other words, if I were to bring in religion, then it becomes a bit contested, because then the politics of food changes. It is like it borders on the line of purity and impurity. So
Mm.
that is another aspect where we can look at food. But I just focused on the edibility of women's bodies. It's just there for consumption. You can just consume them. And I'm not sure if you remember, but there was this advertisement in the presentation. The advertisement was carried out by Nando's. Nando's is a very famous food chain, and
Yeah.
that was specifically grounded in the Indian context. So Nando's printed that advertisement in for their Indian consumers, and there
Yeah.
was a huge uproar in India because they were like, "Oh,
Oh,
yeah, yeah,
oh,
that was that was one that's very one very clear example that I have in my head at the moment. Since I presented it, I showed the advertisement
yeah,
in the presentation.
yeah,
So yeah, more or less it's the same as
yeah.
as I remarked here.
Yeah. So there are quite a few questions coming, but I'm going to abuse my position as chair because I thought about this before Jonathan posted his question, which I think is very interesting. But my question is the notion of women being self-abnegating, but also not eating, eating very little as something that is virtuous. It seems to come up in so many religions. Which religions don't have that kind of idea that women should be starving themselves? Do you know? It seems to be kind of so pervasive.
Yeah, that's true. It's very pervasive because when I read this, I was like, oh, this is something which is also very common in Hinduism. It's like the honors of the women who fast. Almost all the fasting is done by women. Be it
Mm,
so there's one day of fasting which is called Karwa Chauth. It's for
mm,
the long life of the husbands, and
mm.
the paradox is that the woman is fasting for the long life of the husband. I'm like unsure if the husband will also fast for the long life of the wife who will be alive to keep that fast for him as well. So, I mean,
Mm,
the logic of fasting is pretty illogical that way. So,
absolutely.
yes.
Yeah. No, thanks for that. So Jonathan's question is, which I'm going to read, there are quite a few now, and it ties up with the point Mary made. First of all, he says, thanks. I'm wondering about the consumption of the body and blood of Christ in relation to Mary's earlier comment about, I can eat myself well. Any thoughts around religious ritual eating for healing, wellness, and health?
Oh, thank you for this. This is something that I'm in a conflict with at the moment, and I'm still reading up because there are lots of literature that exist to convey what it means to live a fulfilling life, and that too by grounding it in religion. So
Mm,
in Hinduism, we have the whole sattvic tamasic food breakup, which allows you to eat certain foods because they do not produce lustful energy. And there are certain foods that if you consume, like garlic and onion, they lead to they invigorate you. So this is something that I am also looking at, and I am afraid I won't be able to answer much on this.
and this is gendered. So, are you saying that men are encouraged to eat foods that make them lustful and women
No,
are?
no, no,
No.
no. I don't think, no. Yeah, this is applicable for everyone.
Mm, mm. Okay, thank you. Okay, so now we have our two other. Where did you go? Where did you slip out, the two of you? I know there were quite a few comments for Rejoice. Did you look at the comments? Do you want to respond to anything? Especially, I think Yvette's comment about modernization and the role that so-called discourses of modernity have in creating this idea that, you know, there are good citizens who are law-abiding, there are bad citizens who are disruptive. I think that's not all she said, but yeah. Okay, you're on mute.
I think I will respond to the issue of modernity and the way that I looked at it in the lens of my paper. If you look at the issue of informalizing and formalized markets, it's all linked to issues of modernity. And within the same narratives of modernity, the shopping malls and concentration of marketing and selling of food within the big food corporations is also part of modernity. And in the end, it disempowers, disenfranchises the small food producers that are in within the communities and more accessible. So it's fashionable to go and eat out than to maybe buy from a spaza shop close to you. And so to me, that's how I frame the issues of modernity and how it contributes to the disenfranchisement. And then it also builds up to the whole argument that I shared about people resisting and then going in as performance, like one of the participants mentioned, that looting in courts, as we say, the protest, were a show of resistance to these enclaves of food markets because those were targeted. So yeah, I think that's how I'd respond to the issue of modernity.
Mm. But the comments now that are just kind of flooding the place after that long lull. Mapule wants to know, asked about work that you've written, which I'm also, Sona, very, very curious about. So hopefully you can share that at some other point in the conference or maybe even write in the chat. Otherwise, I think we're running out of time. So a lot of these are comments. So I'm going to say Since Rejoice has just spoken, maybe do you want to say some final words in the light of the two other presentations?
Um, whew. I can't think of something particular now.
Mm.
But for me, what was interesting about Rejoices was around the whole framing of
Oops. She's got Mary's had a problem with the connection for a long time. Any final words, Sona, from you?
No, I absolutely enjoyed the previous two presentations and it's been very engaging. So I absolutely love it to be here.
Thank you very much for your. Sorry, Mary, we missed that totally. Do you want to try?
yeah, no, this no, very, very unstable. No, it was. I'm really interesting about because I think when I was still working at the university, for instance, there was the framing of certain groups of people as almost like seeing them as non-human, right?
Mm.
Because it was a state that students would go around and function. They would
Mm.
come and they would eat the food there. And I think they
Mm.
wanted to make a point um,
Mm.
that although there's not money and spaces in dining halls available, there's this absolute gluttonous consumption of foods at conferences, at workshops, etc., in the same campus. And
Mm.
and 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 for me, it is also who was eating, and it was not
Mm.
necessarily the hungry student that would go there, but it was a particular politicized movement to find out where things are happening and food is being provided to
Mm.
raise
Mm.
to make a certain point.
Mm. Yeah, I think that food protests among students is also a huge issue. And also, students, are the ones that are pathologized as irresponsible, reckless, blah, 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 blah. Yeah. Okay, I think we really have to wrap up now. I enjoyed this session tremendously. Thank you very, very much. And I'm hoping that a lot of these conversations will be taken forward. So we break now and come back at, oh God, I'm not a good chair. We come back at, when do we come back? Let me just look. We come back at 12. So we've got quite a short break. And then you can choose to go to either panel 3, which is food in and social history, or humanizing food justice. So see you later, people.
Thank you.